If AI starts taking over jobs and starts reducing the need for humans, then what do humans do? What is their raison d'etre?
Hi, this is Nidhi.
Hi, I'm Aishwarya. Welcome to the CCG Tech Podcast.
We're going to be here talking to Charitarth Bharti about large language processing models. This will be a two-part episode. In the first episode, we'll be discussing large language models, what are they good at, how they are developed, the disruptions they cause to the market, and how these LLMs are being used.
Hey, Charitarth. Thanks so much for agreeing to speak to us today for the CCG Tech Podcast. Can you start off by introducing yourself, please?
Thank you for having me on the podcast. I'm Charitarth Bharti. I'm working with EY and in their privacy and data trust team. I'm also a researcher working on issues at the intersection of privacy and AI. That can involve a fair bit of things, including but not limited to just looking at AI governance as well. The responsible AI principles, which apart from privacy, also include things like fairness and bias, and generally around AI legislation, which is an up and coming field. I'm also a researcher with CCG, the wonderful platform for today, and I am generally a legal and policy professional. I'm based out of Toronto, Ontario.
Thanks so much for coming on board, Charitarth. We've been looking forward to talking about this for a long time now. So today we're talking about large language processing models like ChatGPT. And I'm going to start with the most obvious question. So is AI going to take over our jobs? Like realistically, how good are they? How long would it be before they can take over our jobs?
Uh, that's a very obvious question that a lot of us are wondering at the moment, and a heavy one for that, right? Because you're talking about potentially not Skynet-ish things, but it's pretty drastic if people's employment becomes something that AI starts endangering. And there are bigger things that AI apparently can endanger. It could be democracy. It could be the way that we conduct war, but on a day-to-day basis, right? Like for yourself and anybody going about their business and thinking that we have built ourselves a career or we're moving towards one. AI could disrupt that pretty rapidly, and it's been happening in such a short span of time. So my answer to this would be it's a real possibility because we have seen in certain sectors where AI has been a disruptive presence in the sense that it might not completely eliminate those jobs, right? That is perhaps a far-fetched concern, like that it'll completely eliminate it, but it will reduce the amount of people significantly that would be needed to perform the same operation. And that's optimization at a level that is close to eliminating many, if not all, jobs in certain sectors. And we can think about sectors like radiology, for instance, is one such profession. A lot of people spent a fair amount of their lives training to be radiologists until AI comes in and detects different kinds of cancers or any sort of an anomaly in your scans much better than a radiologist could. So that really leaves you in a situation where you're wondering that your skill sets in whatever domain it is could potentially be replaced quite easily with the capabilities that AI brings. Similarly, and it's not just technical fields, it's also, and this is what the concern was initially, right? That it would be technical fields which would face elimination. Most recently, you would have seen that a lot of coders got laid off in the recent economic downturn. The problem with that is that it's not only just these technical fields, and the reason why coders were being replaced was because coding has become such an easy task with LLMs. You can teach them general languages day to day that we speak, and you can also teach them coding languages, right? So, in that sense, the risk is to technical fields and to non-technical fields, because just as much as an LLM can write code and write and create a software for you or an HTML page, it could also write amazing poetry in the style of whatever you choose and combine multiple styles, or you can choose a topic and it'll create something for you. That is obviously concerning for a lot of people, and SAG-AFTRA, the Screen Actors Guild and the Association of Actors, is currently facing that problem. A lot of the studios apparently in negotiations very openly said that AI is something that can do your job or at least replace a lot of you, if not all of you. There's no clear answers in terms of what business risk and by relation job risks this will have. I guess business risks is one aspect of it. There's also business optimization, which also has job risks, right? For a business, what might be immense amounts of efficiency introduced by LLMs and great amounts of innovation being done might not be great for the workers in those industries. So that's one concern everybody's battling with still. The larger question is, our economic structures have this constant churn, right? Often we think about our economic structures in the sense that if one opportunity closes down in a sector, the worker just moves ahead and reskills and finds elsewhere. And we see this as markets readjusting themselves. How big of a disruptor in the market is AI? Will its employment crisis that it causes, will we be able to fill this up somewhere else? Will those workers be able to migrate somewhere else and find something else? Or could that sector, because multimodal AI or AI in general can disrupt so many different sectors? What happens when if it all happens together? That's one question, and we've seen some problems with this. When you think of companies like Chegg, which was a company which used to help folks with their homework. That company got disrupted by ChatGPT. Its valuations were significantly reduced. Its business model was significantly impacted, and the people who used to work for that company faced some bad outcomes. We've seen this in other sectors as well, where IBM, for instance, specifically said that they're going to pause hiring in several domains and see how this plays out. It's not one kind of job that's also impacted by this. So yeah, there's a fair amount of nervousness around like what will happen with this, and we need to be careful. And I think I really like how Yuval Noah Harari put it. He said like there was the industrial revolution and our manual labor was gone. After that, we were left with intellectual labor, which white collar jobs are what we see as some of the best jobs out there currently for humans to do, and worthy of our time, as a lot of people would think. Not to take away from the fact that all work has meaning, but now he said with AI, even that will be gone if AI starts taking over jobs and starts reducing the need for humans. Then what do humans do? What is their raison d'être? Yeah, it's still something worth exploring before we launch complicated AI systems out into the market. What will be the implications for these job markets? Will we be able to handle it? Again, to make this very long-winded answer in one sentence, we have cause to be concerned. I also want to temper what I'm saying, and not to be sensationalist here. I want to temper this concern and this cause for concern that I'm expressing with the fact and with some hope here that there will also be job creation associated with emerging technology, as there always is. So fields like prompt engineering are popping up now, where you could potentially understand the AI system and then ask it questions and make prompts to that system, which would yield a good result. It's just adapting with the times in a way, in the sense that people who learn this will also be very lucratively employed. There's also reason to hope that with the disruption, there will be job creation in the same breath as there will be job destruction. So it's, if you think about it, just a part of the economic cycle, but it's not going to be all bad. So for those of you who want to cling on to some hope, there is some.
No, I mean, you're right, and that's great because, I mean, essentially, a content creator is not a job that existed like 10 years ago. And now you have a lot of people who make their money entirely from YouTube or TikTok or other social media. So presumably there'll be some kind of shifts that also lead to new kinds of careers that we just don't think about right now. So I know that generative AI in general is like pretty large. Even large language models is a pretty large topic to talk about. So for the purposes of this conversation, it might be useful to just stick to one kind. So let's maybe just stick to text-based models. So things like ChatGPT, for example. It might be useful at this stage to actually just drill down a little bit on what the tech is. And so how would, for example, something like a ChatGPT or a Llama, although I know they work differently, go about answering a question that a user has. So for example, if I was to ask it a question about the three best songs or the three best movies that came out in the past 3 months in whatever language, how would it go about trying to answer that question for me?
Yeah, so to understand these systems, it is a predictive and probabilistic engine of sorts. And essentially, these are probabilistic and predictive engines where they try to predict the next word in a sentence completion structure. So it's going to look at what the next word could be from the immense data that these are trained on, which is often scraped off of the internet. It's often unlabeled and unstructured data, with which they are trained in a self-supervised or a semi-supervised or unsupervised setting. And in those scenarios, what happens is that if it's trying to complete a sentence, so let's assume the sentence with your example to be, what are the best three movies? So it'll look at all of the, let's just for a narrow down on one subset of data that it might have scanned on the internet, which is reviews of movies, right? Amongst all of the things that it would have seen, it would have seen that mostly it is being completed with one particular word, right? It'll assign values to it. Okay, that in terms of the sentence being completed, the first value, the first word that it sees from all of its data set has a 50% chance of being the correct answer. The second one has 60%, and the last one has 70%. So it'll see based on these statistics and not reasoning. And that's the key distinction here. Statistics, it'll see that that's the most probable answer and it'll give you that. So it's sentence completion and it's trying to give you based on what it has seen out there in the world, and which is where things like biases can creep in. It'll try and give you whatever it has seen so far in the data that it has, right? So, and often things that you see online can be vile and vicious and biased, and people can say things like things about black people, about women, about racist stereotypes, about sexist stereotypes, sexist things that could be gathered off of the internet, and it could regurgitate that.
So, I mean, in that case, I guess I have a question about how you'd go about trying to moderate something like this, right? So, because right now, what you are seeing is a lot of different kinds of large language models that are also differentiating themselves based on essentially the amount of manpower and also the kind of like tech they're putting into like moderation. So, how would you go about moderating something? At what stage would you essentially like sort of put in that moderation?
So the moderation that happens on the platform itself, in that sense, they put in guardrails for it to ensure that it does not say things which go against its policy. So these are on top of the LLM. The LLM still has the capability, but the company has put in certain policies in terms of what it will or will not say. And that's a very interesting question in terms of they still have the capability of regurgitating stuff, and you can often circumvent those guardrails. And people do that as a method of testing them as well. And those are called glitch prompts in the sense that it'll make the model glitch and do things that the creators of that model don't want it to do, because there is an inherent level of unpredictability associated with that model. So that problem is something that companies are tackling with at the moment. The regulators are looking at that very, very seriously in terms of the safety and potential for misuse of these models. And if you look at, say, China, it's struggling so much with this because an inherently unpredictable model could say things about, say, the Tiananmen Square, which they don't want said, and about Winnie the Pooh and Xi Jinping. And you don't want that happening in China. Companies could be destroyed in a heartbeat if, and there have been cases of that where those companies have essentially been wiped out because they said something against the establishment. There's no redress or remedy there. Once you found yourself on the wrong side of the Chinese establishment, you're quite certain not to exist as a company for a while. But that is one of the main problems, the unpredictability of this. And that is a very interesting problem as well, because Western liberal democracies, where we can freely scrape data off the internet, we have freedom of speech, freer societies than in China. If, say, for instance, Chinese companies want to train a model, they cannot use those same data sets because those might be something which go against the line of the CCP, the Chinese Communist Party. So for them, making LLMs, which is a huge income and soft power generator in this time, is one of the major problems. How do you make effective LLMs when you cannot scrape enough data? And these are data heavy technologies. So that is one geopolitical consequence as well of a very very technical point in terms of how these technologies are built. So, that's another sort of a Pandora's box that we can open.
So speaking of Pandora's box, actually, now that we've opened this one, and now that we've demystified the use of things like ChatGPT a bit more, I think over the last few months since it came out last year, I have seen it used for just about everything from financial planning to diet plans to just about everything. So we've talked a little bit about things that they can do and things that they may not be so good at doing. So generally, what are the kind of things that we can sort of use these technologies for, and what are things that they'd be bad at, things that we should not be using them for?
I mean, I would say don't be using them to write your legal briefs. That's for one. Somebody tried that, didn't work out that well for them. Don't be using this to be factful about something, to be authoritative about something. And speaking of authoritative, it can create things out of thin air, right? And that's the major problem because it'll tell you what it thinks you want to hear. And I'm using the words it thinks in a very loose fashion here. Please do not think that it is a person, that it has the capability to think. It does not. And that is the main point. You are consulting something which you think is impressively smart. It's giving you the impression, but it is not. It is a statistical engine. So do not use this for things where you need to be incredibly accurate, where you need to be sharing data, for instance. So sometimes to get a response out of a system like an LLM, you might need to input things into it. If that data is sensitive data of, which is perhaps proprietary or personal data, this data will then be open to usage in other ways, and it goes out of your control, and it's no longer confidential, or it's no longer private. So for you to be asking it questions, you have to realize that anything and everything you say will be used against you in a court of law kind of, Miranda rights way. It's essential that we realize that this is not a replacement for human effort and human fact checking, or for the ability of humans to think and be responsible also for what they put out into the public domain, especially if you're putting that out in a court of law as a legal brief, or if it's your work deliverable. I would not, and anybody would not, and ChatGPT itself or most of these models do give out the caveat that they can be inaccurate and they shouldn't be fed information which is private or sensitive.
So I guess people should not be trying to use this to write their exams or tests of some kind. But also sort of taking forward from what you said about the court of law. So I think models like ChatGPT have found themselves in legal trouble recently. And also, I know we discussed a little bit about how these models are performing in the rest of the world. But if we look at cases from Europe specifically, which currently is investigating ChatGPT for violations of privacy, all of this stemming from what Italy's data protection regulator was talking about earlier this year, where I think countries are also now sort of disillusioned with the promises that these models brought. And a lot of people are now talking about investigating them for violations of privacy. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, so that was Europe being the vanguard of all tech troubles that happen in the world, and being at the forefront of identifying them and trying to fix them. So at least Garante, which is the data protection regulator, called up OpenAI for its release of ChatGPT in Italy and in Europe, and for a while, temporarily, it was not available there. But there's four problems under GDPR that the regulator identified, which were that it doesn't have age controls to stop people under the age of 13 from using the system, and it can say inaccurate things, something we discussed, and that's a major problem. The kind of disinformation, aspects of it, which not in the direct purview of the data protection regulators, still have societal issues. The other problems they talked about were that it's dealing with data that people haven't been told that it will be collected and used for this purpose. So that's an issue with the training data of ChatGPT and other LLMs. And most importantly, perhaps, it's that it has no legal basis for collecting people's personal information and creating these like massive swells of data to train the models that they usually do. These are the four things that they talked about, and they found that it's evidently in breach of data protection law, and it's just the beginning of the kind of problems that they will be facing. Data protection is one thing at the heart of AI systems like these, because often, and not just this, and there's very credible research to also prove this. This research was from researchers at Google, DeepMind, UC Berkeley, ETH Zurich, and Princeton. What they did was very important in showing the lack of privacy and the ease of extracting this training data from these image diffusion models. And granted that this is not dealing with LLMs per se, but the kind of privacy problems that are associated with these models which scrape data off the internet, that became very clear with it, in the sense that what happened was that they were very clearly able to see from the images that were generated from stable diffusion, an AI model for creating images. They were able to see and extract the actual training data images from the ones that were generated. And this essentially is sensitive data. It's somebody's face, somebody's picture, and it could be biometric trouble as well for these companies which are behind these models. This research was very important in showing the problems that exist with generative AI at large. Of course, not specifically with LLMs, but LLMs themselves have their own privacy issues. Same in similar ways, this training data that's undergirding these systems can be regurgitated by way of querying the system in creative ways and prompting it in creative ways, which can be highly problematic for people who actually create the stuff that this model is trained on. These could be artists, these could be folks who have created stuff with the sweat of their brow and now don't enjoy the benefits of that. It could be copyrighted material that could be used. And the EU AI Act and so many other data protection regulators, the Copyright Office in the US, they're looking at this very actively and saying that you have to tell us the provenance of the data. Where is this data coming from? Is this copyrighted data that you have trained this on? And that goes to all of the generative AI models wherever it's used. It's using data for the purposes of training their system. So it's also a question of who gets to enjoy the fruits of this labor. Does OpenAI, Google get to enjoy the fruits of somebody else's labor by training a model which is reliant on other people's work and then creating all of this new content which is based on the work of other people, and also throws up other questions of who the actual work that is generated from these models belongs to? Can you copyright it in your name? A lot of copyright offices, courts don't believe so, because they see humanity as one element which is very essential to having a copyright registered in your name. And they are rejecting the attempts to register a copyright on work products, which are generated using such LLMs or generative AI systems.
Yeah, that's actually really interesting. I didn't realize it was possible to sort of retrace training data from the sort of images that were generated by these image-based generative AI systems. I think I've seen a couple of, actually, on Reddit now, a bunch of people who play around with different prompts on ChatGPT and similar things, where you ask them to write like a viral Reddit post, for example, one of these models, and then it comes up with something that sounds very similar and very plausible to something that you'd find in any of the subreddits. And so I guess I'm just thinking of, like, similar to like an image scraping sort of like system, you also can have, I mean, technically all of this is also copyrighted because technically it is authored by the people who wrote the post and is now publicly available. Although it wouldn't be as recognizable, I guess, as like an image, and wouldn't lead to quite the same issues. But this is something that actually comes up in the personal data protection law in India as well, because we have an exemption now that essentially exempts personal any kind of information that is made available by the data principal, so the person who that data belongs to. When they make it publicly available, essentially the Data Protection Act would not apply. And I think the specific sort of example there is that, someone, while blogging her views, if she makes any kind of personal information available, then the provisions of the Act wouldn't apply to that information. It seems like this is a sort of an exemption that's made specifically to make scraping a little bit easier and to exempt like scraping from data protection obligations. So I was wondering if you had thoughts about what the kinds of implications of this might be, and also, I guess, like, potentially what the, as in, like, what the logic behind this kind of exemption would be, essentially to make it easier to scrape, so that I guess you also have the ability for industries to be able to use a larger and more diverse data set to sort of create their models that are then used in different ways. So I was wondering if you had any thoughts on that.
Yeah, super interesting problem to have, right? Like, it's data protection regulators and legislators have to somehow enable the AI ecosystem, because one is connected to the other in a very deep fashion, in the sense that if you don't have the ability to use this data by way of legal permissions that are granted in data protection regulations or circumvented, as I will also briefly discuss, but unless you have the ability to collect vast amounts of data, you will lag behind. You will not be able to go up to each and every individual whose data it is and seek their permission. It's another thing that they might say no, but I don't think they want to come asking as well, right? Because it's just not feasible. So what you need is governments enabling the collection of that data in some ways. And India's data protection law seems to be geared towards that. And it's not alone in trying to gain, an upper hand in developing AI systems. It is a possible way of it. There's a lot of geopolitical implications to development of AI systems indigenously in countries, and also financial implications for that. So if you are the country which has a more pro innovation, I'll use UK's phrasing in this, they are a pro innovation approach. So India is taking a sort of a similar route, where it's allowing these companies to come and train data, and collect data and use that to train their AI systems. And this forms the foundation of that. Of course, it's not explicitly said in the legislation that this is the reason why, but publicly available data is becoming a problem across jurisdictions, and it is grossly violative of privacy protections that should be available to people. So in the US as well, for instance, the government, and you can't say that this is solely to make AI systems, but like the government is also circumventing regulations around publicly available data by purchasing it from other folks, from data brokers. So when they're doing that, by purchasing it from these brokers, they bring it out of the ambit of the law. Then it's usable by them for whatever reasons that they see fit. This exemption and the other exemptions that the DPDP provides, or DPDPA provides, also with voluntary data that might be provided under 7A. So these kind of things point to the government building this law with an intention of having companies come and use the vast troves of data that India generates. And that's obviously something which is problematic. By and large, I don't think India will be the only place where we will see this, right? We'll see this happen across jurisdictions as countries race to develop their indigenous AI systems.
This was part one of a two-part series on generative AI. Please stay tuned for the next part, which will be in the next episode. We would love to hear your thoughts on the episode and your suggestions on what topics you would like us to cover. You can reach out to us through email or find us on our social media. We will link the details of these in the show notes. Lastly, we would like to thank National Law University Delhi and the Friedrich Naumann Foundation for Freedom for their support in creating the podcast. If you enjoyed the conversation, please like and subscribe wherever you're listening to the podcast. We look forward to bringing you more content. This podcast is created by Center for Communication Governance at National Law University Delhi. This episode was edited by Gopika.